Earlier this week on Wednesday, I got a call from Haley, one of our members. And Haley called me and said, I've got a question for you. And whenever Haley calls and says, I have a question for you, I know we're going to go into some deep spiritual waters. And so Haley says, on Easter, I listened to some other sermons. And I didn't say this, but I was thinking, well, Haley, that's your first problem right there. How dare you? Okay, give me a laughing emoji in the chat section so that I know that you know that I'm kidding right now. But I was thinking, how dare you listen to another sermon? But she was listening to another sermon on Easter. And the message that Haley got from that sermon was, you must believe in the literal resurrection of Jesus for any of this to actually work. For you to have faith and belief, you have to believe literally in the physical resurrection of Jesus, or Christianity means nothing. Have you heard this kind of Easter message before? Haley said that she responded inside of herself, that something resisted this message, that there was something that she found not helpful in this message, something actually wrong in this message. It didn't feel right to her. And as I like to do in these conversations, I basically say, Haley, tell me more about that. And so Haley says, basically, if the resurrection is used as a weapon against others to say, you must believe this or you are wrong, then I don't want to believe in the resurrection. I don't want to believe in Christianity. This is just another way for faith, for dogma to be imposed on people, and it doesn't feel right to me. And I was like 3 cheers for Haley. This is exactly it. And if you have doubts about the literal physical resurrection of Jesus, I want you to know that that's normal. Having doubts about the resurrection is normal. In fact, I am a little suspicious of people who come into these kinds of spaces and have such a firm grasp on what people should believe. I am suspicious about it because I think it can often be a cover for the doubt that pastors like me have about a literal resurrection. It's almost like the more, intense that people have about dogmas concerning religion and Christianity, the more there's something underneath there. There's doubt underneath there. We all have doubt. In fact, one of my favorite resurrection stories is precisely about this. It's found in Matthew chapter 28. Jesus has been resurrected, and he is in front of his disciples on a mountain. And it says that the disciples all saw Jesus, and some of them doubted. If you have doubts today, you are in good company. Those disciples of the first century who walked and talked and lived with Jesus for so long, guess what? They had doubts too. Doubt is normal. And the point of Christianity is not to get yourself to believe in some kind of dogma that is just impossible for you to believe in. This might be a dogma that's impossible for you to believe in. And I want you to know that you still have a place here. Why? Because the disciples in Matthew 28 doubted the resurrection of Jesus. And how does Jesus respond to them? Not by saying, turn or burn. Not by saying, you better believe in the literal resurrection of me or you're going to hell. Jesus doesn't say that. In fact, what does Jesus say? He doesn't shame them for their doubts. What he does instead is say, I have a mission for you. And that mission is to go spread the good news of God's love through to the ends of the earth. This is one of the key points of Christianity, which is that you may have doubts. In fact, I would say that you probably do have doubts. And guess what? Jesus resurrects in our lives and says, you still have a mission. There's still a purpose for you. Just because you have doubts doesn't mean that God has given up on you. In fact, what it means is that God still has a purpose for you. Can I get an amen in the chat section? This is what the resurrection is all about. If you think that the resurrection is a metaphor, a great story, amen. If you think that the resurrection is literal and Jesus literally resurrected in bodily form, amen. Whatever you think about the resurrection, the point is that God has a mission for you, a mission for us. And that is, throughout the Gospels, Jesus tells us to love God and to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. So if you hear Christian pastors, religious figures demanding that you believe in God in a certain way or else it's all for nothing, don't believe those lies. Those are lies. It is for everything. It is for the world, that the world may come to know a God who is not a God of judgment, a God who does not come to us shaming us for our doubts, but a God who meets us where we are and travels on the road with us, just as we are and just as we are becoming, leading us into a better future where there is more love and more forgiveness, more mercy, more compassion for everybody. And this is why the resurrection is so important. Whether you think it's a metaphor, whether you think it's literal, this is why these stories are so important, because today the resurrection story is about two disciples on the road to Emmaus. These disciples, one of them is named Cleopas, one of them is not named. It might be Mrs. Cleopas. We don't know. It might be some other disciple. The point, actually, many scholars think, is that this disciple is not named because Luke wants you to put yourself in the story. You are here on the day of the first Easter, the day of resurrection, walking along with Cleopas on the road to a town called Emmaus. And what is the point of Emmaus? Well, Emmaus, if some of you have been to Israel, I haven't been to Israel, but I've heard that there are like a bunch of Emmauses around. And that's because nobody knows exactly where Emmaus was in the first century. And so, to get tourists to come to Emmaus, a bunch of people are like, hey, we're the Emmaus. No, we're the Emmaus. Come here and give us your money, right? So there are multiple Emmauses. They don't even know if Emmaus actually existed in the first century. And here's the point. Emmaus could be anywhere. Emmaus could be us walking away from Jerusalem towards somewhere else called Emmaus. Why is this important? Because everything in Luke centers around Jerusalem. The risen Jesus is supposed to be in Jerusalem. And these two disciples walk away from Jerusalem. Do you ever feel like you're walking away from religion, from God, from the point of life? Do you ever feel like sometimes you're just missing something? You're missing the point? Well, guess what? Jesus comes to you. The risen Christ comes to you and walks on the road to Emmaus with you. Sometimes we're trying to run away from things in life that matter. And guess what? God meets us there, just as we are. Not as we should be, not in judgment against us, but God, the risen Christ, comes to us just as we are, walking on the journey with us on the road to Emmaus, the places that maybe we're not supposed to go. The resurrected Christ comes to us and meets us there. Now, many of these resurrection stories show us that the risen Christ meets us in who we think are strangers, in our fellow human beings. The risen Christ comes to Mary on the morning of the first Easter in a gardener, a stranger. Here on the road to Emmaus, the disciples, for some reason, couldn't see that this was the risen Christ with them. Maybe Christ looked like a stranger to them. What the resurrection stories say to us is that Christ meets us on the journey and often meets us in strangers, in our fellow human beings. God comes to us in drag. The risen Christ comes to us in drag, in our fellow human beings. This is the great spiritual insight of Ram Dass. God in drag comes to us in the bodies of our fellow human beings. If we have the eyes to see God's presence among us, and if we don't have the eyes to see the risen Christ among us, that's okay too. Because the risen Christ is still there, walking with us, traveling with us when we're on the road to Emmaus. At the end of the story, you may have noticed that Jesus, the risen Christ, breaks bread, gives it to the disciples. He nourishes them even when they miss the point, even when they miss seeing the resurrected Christ in their midst. Jesus does not shame them. He feeds them. He gives them nourishment for the journey. Many communion liturgies, when we have communion, emphasize what's typically called the Last Supper. That is a misnomer, because the Last Supper is not the night that Jesus was betrayed. The Last Supper in the Gospels is the resurrected Jesus coming to his disciples, not shaming them for however they abandoned him in his time of need, but resurrecting in their presence, saying, I don't hold it against you, and let's eat. That's the Last Supper. And there is no Last Supper, because Jesus continues to be present among us at every communion, and really at every meal. Jesus is present with us, because the resurrected Christ resurrects in our lives, often in places that are difficult for us to see and understand. But Christ is there, traveling with us, loving us just as we are and just as we are becoming. May we continue to live into that spirit, traveling with one another, loving one another just as we are and just as we are becoming too. Amen.